Okay, the first turning point event. This happens in April of 1861 when Fort Sumter, which is an island fort in just off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, gets bombed for over an entire day by the South Carolina militia. Nobody actually dies, which is stunning after a whole day of bombing. Nobody actually dies, but this fort has been attacked and does have to surrender to South Carolina. And that's the first turning point event. So before this event, actually in the North, only New England was supporting war, and the southern states were hoping to get away with splitting off without any war at all. But again, the only real support for war was in New England, the strongest anti-slavery area, that sort of Yankeedom area of the United States. New York's mayor was actually thinking of joining along and maybe seceding as well, because New York's always been that kind of different sort of area of the North. There was also growing support for maybe making a constitution amendment to slavery to allow slavery to be permanent. There was talk of like a peace treaty getting arranged. War was not inevitable before Fort Sumter. Okay, but after Fort Sumter, there was really no turning back. Feelings of nationalism in the other areas outside of the New England and Yankee kind of area really took hold in Midlands kind of areas. Even New York City's mayor totally changes his mind. He's not talking about seceding anymore. He's going to help Lincoln support his idea to bring out more troops. At one point, even Virginia was considering staying in the in the Union. And the other thing that happens on both sides, those militias, those sort of temporary fighting forces, turn to real armies. You're going to have real armies coming along now. After Fort Sumter, it's definitely going to be war. The next turning point moment happens in late 1862. It's the Emancipation Proclamation, made an announcement by Abraham Lincoln that all slaves in the southern states will be treated as free persons. I'm boiling it down here, but basically it announced that any military soldiers, when they encounter a slave in a Confederate state, they need to allow them to be set free, and this leads to thousands of slaves getting set free. Starting in 1863. He announces it in 1862, it starts in 1863. This is a turning point because before the Emancipation Proclamation, before that announcement, there were a couple things going on. One is that really the only cause for this war was preserving the Union, keeping all the states together, which maybe got folks excited in 1861, but wasn't really such a thrilling idea in 1862 or 1863 after over a year of war. The other issue that Lincoln had to consider with this is that the Confederacy was trying to get help from England and from France. Remember, that's what helped the colonies to get their independence in the Revolutionary War. The Confederacy was trying the same thing, and it looked like it might start working. At least one, or if not both of those countries, would help fight against the North, against the United States. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, there's really no way that England or France could join in. Once Lincoln's made this war about slavery, about freeing slaves, about a sort of new level of freedom, really puts a new sort of spin on this war and the cause that the Union troops are fighting for. And that makes it really impossible for England and France to join in. They abolished slavery decades earlier. So for them to fight against the ending of slavery really just made it pretty much impossible for them. And they did not end up joining, and that's probably one of the many reasons why the South ended up losing this war. And Shelby Foote has a really great quotation about this, that Lincoln had shattered the main pillar of what had been the Southern president's chief hope. In July 1863, there's a battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There's another significant one, the same exact days, in Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. But I'm going to focus on Gettysburg just to make things simpler here. There were many, many soldiers at this battle. This is a 3-day battle. The U.S. side does end up winning this battle. It's the worst in terms of deaths and injuries, the worst battle, the most dead, the most injured of any other battle in this rather random town in southern Pennsylvania against the Battle of Gettysburg. This battle is a big deal because before the Battle of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee's, the Southern Army, just seemed to be unbeatable. They were really completely on a roll. They'd had several seemingly impossible wins at places like Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, places in Virginia. Earlier in 1863 and even into 1862, Lee's decisions has always worked out. Even when he did things that went against the textbook, he would take his small army and split it into smaller armies, which you're never supposed to do as a military leader. And it just seemed to always work out. He really seemed like it wasn't going to be defeated and that the North was going to have to surrender. This battle, before this battle, his army had marched through Maryland, and then they'd just gotten into Pennsylvania. This is deep into Northern Territory, where they'd never been this far up before, and it seemed like they could just keep on marching, maybe as far as Philadelphia or New York City. So after the Battle of Gettysburg, after that loss, as I said before, the Union wins this battle, Lee's army has to go back south. They never get that far north again. They have to leave Pennsylvania, go farther south through Maryland, and end up basically staying in Virginia for the rest of the war. So it has that effect. Another one is that Robert E. Lee never acts quite as confidently again as he did at Gettysburg. He makes a major decision at that battle to send a huge charge of over 20,000 troops up a hill. None of them make it up to the top of the hill. Many of them, as many as half of them, get killed or hurt. And he never acts quite so confident again as he did in the months before, when he was on that roll of victory after victory. He fights a much different war from that point, a much more defensive kind of war. There's almost 2 more years of war left, but it's never really quite the same as it had been in those months leading up to Gettysburg. It's really that kind of turning moment. The end isn't inevitable. There's still a lot more battles to be fought, but looking back on it, this really seems to be that one where the North really kind of takes over and gets the momentum to move on to victory. Alright, next we're going to zoom ahead to 1864, and really it's 2 events happening at about the same time. In some ways they're different, but I'm really going to try to squish them together here. One is Sherman's march. William Sherman, Union general, takes his army marching all the way through Georgia and then up South Carolina. They're not fighting battles, they're destroying any farms, they're using all the food that they can find, they're wrecking railroad tracks, factories, doing everything they can to stop the area of Georgia from helping the Confederate armies that are fighting in other kinds of places. A similar kind of destruction is happening in Virginia. In Petersburg, around Petersburg, is a city or town near the capital of the Confederacy. And what you have there is a different kind of destruction. You have trench kind of warfare. If you've ever seen sort of World War I kind of warfare of soldiers kind of digging little open tunnels and lobbing bombs at each other, that's the kind of war that's going on there. So you have these 2 kinds of events. You have the first use of machine guns happening at that place in Virginia. And again, there are about 200,000 soldiers total in trenches, just bombing the heck out of each other. Again, not a normal kind of battle when we think of other Civil War battles. And they were doing this for months. Sherman's march along takes several months, and also this kind of trench warfare from sort of open tunnel to open tunnel is several months long as well. So, as I was hinting, before these kind of turning point events, you basically had 3 years of classic kind of battles of soldiers lining up and firing against other soldiers who were lined up on the other side of a field. Things like Gettysburg, for example. You had rifles and muskets, you had cannons being used, the kind of weapons that can only fire once at a time, so and have to get reloaded, and again, some cannons need several minutes to fire. Rifles, you could fire a couple times in a minute. And you also had civilians, people not in the military, weren't usually affected directly by the war. You could hear the army coming, for one thing, and you could get out of the way, and these battles were happening in fields, not in towns where people were actually living. So after these events, really as they start and then continuing on, and further into human history too, we have this idea of total warfare. What war means has really changed from what Sherman does in Georgia and South Carolina, of attacking factories and farms and taking things from civilians, not hurting them, There are very few reports of people getting hurt, non-military people getting hurt. But the point is that afterwards, everything seemed to be fair game. Everything seemed to be fair to be able to attack, to bomb. The old rules just don't apply anymore. Machine guns are able to do tons more different kind of damage to a line of troops advancing. The rules need to get rewritten. Technology advances. Again, railroads need to get protected in a way that no one had thought of protecting them before. And there's the question of where will this end? Of course, about 100 years later, we get to things like atomic bombs. So really, after these two, Grant was the Union general, Sherman the other Union general in the South, in Georgia, doing that march. They've sort of rewritten the rules of what is okay and necessary to do in war. Last turning point we're going to look at is not a military event, it's a political one. This is Abraham Lincoln gets re-elected in 1864. He had to run for re-election 4 years after 1860 when he got in there at first. And as you can see on the map here, he wins big time. All those red states where he ends up getting the majority. We should also note that part of what helps him win is news of General Sherman's victories and all the damage he's doing down in South Carolina and Georgia with his marching around. But this is the real turning point here, is Lincoln will definitely stay as president for the next, well, for as long as he can. This is a huge turning because before that election, it wasn't certain that Lincoln was going to win. In fact, there's some letters from him of writing to other folks like his wife and saying he expects to lose. He expects to get his butt kicked. The guy he's going up against this is part of my favorite of the story here. This is General George McClellan, who had actually been the general following Lincoln's orders earlier in the war. McClellan runs for office against his former boss, and McClellan is very appealing to some folks because he says, I'll just end this war, we'll make a deal with the South, we might let them stay as a separate country, but we'll stop all the fighting and all the bloodshed that's been going on for these 3 years. And that's very appealing to some folks. The Confederate Army at this point in 1864 is just holding on, hoping that Lincoln will lose, because then that means peace. So again, the army, like Lee, can be more on the defensive, just don't do anything stupid, stay on the battlefield. And after 3 years of war dragging on, hundreds of thousands dead and injured, a lot of folks are ready for what McClellan has to offer, and Lincoln would get booted out. But Lincoln wins, so afterwards he's gained a lot of confidence in what he's been asked to do. The people enough of them have voted him in, so he feels like he's got some more power to do some things that he might have been holding back about before, and we can hear that in some of his later speeches. Again, it gives 4 more years for him to fight the war if he needs to, if he can make it that long. It shows the nation's approval also. It's the first kind of vote after the Emancipation Proclamation had gone through, so it seems to be a vote that the people support his idea about being the war, being against slavery. It's really the first time we see the nation's voted on a main issue kind of like that. And now at this point too, the Confederacy can't hope for a political victory. When McClellan gets voted out, or loses the election, they're stuck with going up against Lincoln. It's going to have to be a military victory, and then the Confederacy starts acting a lot more desperate than they were before. And that ends up leading to the end, is just a few months after that election, making it a turning point.